Jay Callahan with another one of our video mini lectures, and I want to speak in this video about a comparison of the different crisis intervention models that we've talked about so far in the class. So in some ways I just want to call your attention to a handout, a two-page summary that's listed in Sakai, and it's called Crisis Intervention Comparison of Models. I couldn't really fit it on PowerPoint here, and I don't want to walk through the whole thing. I just want to call your attention to this handout, which will do this kind of comparison, right? So far in this class, in our 7 modules, I think, we've talked about individual crisis intervention, the problem-solving model. We've talked about critical incident stress debriefing. We've talked about psychological first aid, and then most recently we talked about early intervention, the newer terminology that in the field of traumatic stress has kind of replaced crisis intervention. And so I made up this handout, as I said, called Crisis Intervention, Comparison of Models, that lists the 4 models across the top and then compares them on different aspects of how they operate. For example, target clients. And just as an example of that, for instance, individual crisis intervention is targeted for clients who are asking for help, who are coming in for help on their own volition, and those tend to be people. Well, I won't get into that. That's another one of the different variables. But people who are in crisis, who are seeking help. The target client for people with critical incident stress debriefing are first responders who have been through a critical incident together, and it makes sense to treat them as a group together. The target audience, the target clients for psychological first aid are victims of natural disasters or other widespread traumatic events that affect a lot of people, in the sense that they are also often out of a home, nowhere to go, nowhere to live, need much more dramatic kind of concrete help than the other 2 examples that we've talked about. Mass violence events. Obviously 9/11 would fit into that category. And then finally, the early intervention. The recent empirical studies of early intervention is focused on clients who self-report to the ER for one reason or another and were willing to participate in those studies. So that would just be an example of how, I'm trying to clarify a comparison between these different kinds of crisis intervention. And it goes across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different variables to compare and contrast. Another example is coping styles. So what does that mean? Well, it's been argued that critical incident stress debriefing, simply by focusing on getting together and talking over the event in a group, revealing one's thoughts and feelings, that it tends to undermine or downgrade other kinds of coping styles. Like, what about the people who just want to, and who do cope well by going for a walk in the woods and isolating themselves in nature? Isn't that also a legitimate way to cope? Then you could make that argue about individual crisis intervention too, except that with individual crisis intervention, people are self-referring, self-choosing to come in to talk to a professional. With CISD, in some of the early CISD for years, it would be mandated, and police officers and firefighters would not have a choice. They were required to come to it. And by that approach, you could see how it might devalue and undermine other kinds of coping styles. And again, privilege let's talk it over together. Psychological first aid, according to its champions, argues that it supports all kinds of coping styles, because you're just spending time talking to the person and doing whatever helps them with whatever they need at the time. And then finally, the new early intervention studies, since again they're meeting with people who come to an ER, the focus is on a formal kind of crisis intervention psychotherapy session, that again it focuses on people who cope by focusing on their feelings and emotions, processing their thoughts and feelings, introspection, things like that. So again, other examples I put on the slide here are a comparison of the content of what goes on, a comparison of the timing, and then when you look at the original handout, there's other categories that we're going to compare these different models. Okay, and this is kind of as a culmination of our first 7 modules here, our first 7 weeks talking about crisis intervention, and next we'll be moving on to emergency intervention. Okay, so I'll see you next time.